Jake, what I thought we'd do is we talk for like 40 minutes or so about comedy and cancel culture, get your perspective on it, and you can give me some shit about my bad tweet on Chappelle. but then in the second half, because I'd like to have you for the parrot room, you can really go after me about Chappelle, and at the end of that, I'll be crying. Is a thought. So if people want to see me cry on camera, like a Jordan Peterson, they can look to the parrot room. So that's how we'll do this.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Flores. I am a stand-up comedian, originally from Texas. I live in Brooklyn now, and I'm based out of New York. And I'm also a podcaster. I have a podcast called Pod Damn America. That's a leftist podcast, pretty run-of-the-mill. It's run by me and two other comedians. And another one called Why You Mad that's more about, like, culture and art and stuff like that I do with a friend of mine who's an anthropologist and a comedy booker. And, so, I mean, basically, I've got a foot in each of these worlds, stand-up comedy and, organizing and theory and stuff like that.
So what brought us together for this recording, and I just said it, but I'll say it again, was that I decided it would be a good idea to try to market a book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns by walking into the battle about Dave Chappelle's recent comedy concert and got ratioed like I'd never been ratioed before. It was an amazing experience. And you popped off with just a simple no to my tweet. I'll say I regret the second tweet. I regret the tweet where I said Dave Chappelle's concert was moving and that anyone who thought he was transphobic hadn't seen it. That's obviously wrong, right? I mean, people saw it. People who are trans saw it, and they thought it was transphobic. And my reaction as a Gen X, cis white guy is not necessarily the litmus test for whether or not it was transphobic. But one of the things that came out of our exchange was that you said that people in comedy don't have the same attitude, I guess, about cancel culture, maybe, or about these kinds of issues as might be thought, that the only like Gavin McInnes and Steven Crowder really take this position.
Well,
is that a fair characterization of what you tweeted? Or
sure, and like everything on Twitter, it's a reduction of what I or you were trying to say, and so there's more to it than that. I think it's the point I was trying to make, I guess, is specifically about the point of view that I feel like you and Burgess are coming from, especially with writing a book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, is that what I see as a comic a lot is people who are fans of comedy who believe that they are speaking in defense of and on behalf of comedians as if comedians are a singular movement when they talk about stuff like cancel culture. And that sort of then plays out into this thing where then if you disagree with your own fans or something and say, I don't see it that way, they go, well, you're not really a comedian, because what I've decided is this premise that it's comedians versus cancel culture and so on and so forth. And so the first thing that I felt really compelled to point out here is that, like with Burgess's book, which I liked, I read his book and we had him on my show and we had a really good conversation. And by the way, up top, I appreciate you guys, the funny thing about this is that I think it's really great that you're so candid and that you, completely see the situation for what it is and had a good laugh about getting ratioed and stuff like that.
Right.
A lot of people aren't. A lot of people go straight into, fist fighting after this sort of stuff.
Right.
And that's clearly not a good, there's nothing productive about that. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that about Burgess as well. But I will say about his book is, when I read it, that's the first thing that occurred to me was, this guy's not a comic. And I know a lot of other comics that are somewhat involved in left stuff, even if it's just to the extent of being on like left Twitter. And I can't say that I count a lot of like comedians I know as people who were like appreciative of that point of view and that book, especially leftists. The only ones that I know that particularly see things that way tend to come out of the right-wing media sphere that is also very prevalent, and in my opinion in comedy kind of something to keep an eye on right now, because I name dropped like Gavin McInnes, failed comedian, and he went from trying to do stand-up to alternative media, and then that turned into the Proud Boys and all of...
Did he do Vice before he was a stand-up, or was that after?
I'm not really sure which one of those came first, because I know he did Vice, so early in his life. But I think it was all one big ball of accident. He was just like a culture guy back then, and he had inklings of points of view like this. Like one of his big things that I remember, and this is all a journey for myself too, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was, born, wise and all this stuff, and I know everything. But like, I remember early on reading Gavin McInnes, and he would say something that really resonated with me as a comic, which is he would talk about race, and he would talk about how liberal, like white people, are overly sensitive about words that aren't even about them. And if you're really down with, like, you live in Brooklyn and you live around people of color, if you know them well enough, you're literally, making the jokes that these white people in their little condos are getting offended about. And then you look at that and you go, okay, like, what do we make of this? And the math on it, to me, in retrospect, is now pretty obvious. Like, people like that really like to point out, like, the things that are inconsistent about liberals who cynically utilize identity politics. But the problem is, I think it's correct diagnosis, incorrect prescription. Like, liberals.
I mean, obviously, with Gavin McInnes, it's clearly the wrong prescription. I mean, the guy's a nutbag. But go on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. I mean, it's pretty. I was getting off on a tangent here, but I mean, well, I mean, this comes back down to looking at cancel culture from a left perspective. Like, I think we're looking at things that we can all agree are, if you are looking at them in this way, something maybe not great is happening here. But then where we go from there with this argument, I think that's where things get a little bit hairy, and we're gonna have to get into it here in this conversation.
Yeah. You know what? Right now, you know what I'm thinking, Jake? Thinking in the future I should use a comb before I do these things. Okay. But also, all right. So I want to push back a little bit about what you just said. Nothing about Gavin having the right critique of liberals, but the wrong solution for it. I mean, obviously that's true, and I also do think you're right. I would, better than I, but that a right wing version of comedy is being born and has been. It's never really gone away. It's been there, right? There have been right wing comics. But I just feel as though maybe there's an older school, like Gen X and Boomer, set of comedians who have a similar perspective, like Bill Burr or Seinfeld, or the late Norm Macdonald, or on and on and on. Who I think that you could pull any one of those types of pretty big mainstream established comedians who would have this perspective. And what I think is defensible in the perspective like that Norm Macdonald put forward, and I don't know Norm Macdonald's politics, but I know I wouldn't consider him a leftist by any stretch, right?
Not at all. No,
right?
He's very conservative, actually.
He was, for a Canadian, he was conservative, right?
Yeah. No one is mourning his politics. That's something that we're getting conflated here, because he didn't do political comedy.
He didn't. No, I know.
Because he's funny and he died, but no one's
right.
Like, but his takes about Afghanistan,
Yeah, no, but right. He didn't do political comedy, but he did have a perspective on what comedy was and what the kind of ethos of a comedian should be, which wasn't about politics. Like one of the things you would say, because when people die that I kind of like, I become like super obsessed and dive down the rabbit hole. And like, I actually, after I watched Dave Chappelle's concert, I said, "Oh, I hope he dies soon." Because then I can watch everything that he does.
It would be
everything
so
he
funny
ever
if
did.
he died and then everyone just backtracked and was like, "Oh,
Right.
I always loved him. He was the greatest."
I don't wish Dave Chappelle any ill, but if he did die, it would give me great opportunity to obsess about him. But anyway, so Norm Macdonald, one of the things he said is his favorite comedian is Bob Hope. And because Bob Hope didn't have anything to say, he didn't even have good jokes. He just had his raw talent as a comedic presence, sort of what Norm Macdonald would say.
Yeah.
And so Macdonald has this sort of view of comedy as some sort of, he had this view of comedy as some sort of, I almost like art for its own sake, or laughs for their own sake. I think Conan O'Brien might have said similar things at some point. And I don't agree that comedy shouldn't be political, or that you can't do more with it than just get laughs. I definitely, like, my favorite comedians include like Stuart Lee. But nonetheless, I do appreciate that. And I feel as though having another value other than the political message for a comedy concert or for a comedian is defensible, maybe not correct, or, maybe you have to think about both things. But I think that might be a more common view amongst certain comedians than not just a right-wing view.
Well, okay, so right off the bat, see, there's something tricky that just happened. This is, you named a handful of comedians and identified them all as older, like Gen X and boomers, right?
Mm.
But the other thing that all those people have in common is that they're rich and they're made it out of, ostensibly the working class, if they were ever in it. A lot of people in the arts never were. They just sort of walked directly into this posh lifestyle. And I think at the heart of like those particular that class of comedians having this point of view in common, to me, the explanation is way more that they've become professionals, right? So there's this tweet Steve Albini did about it that I had pulled up because I thought he sort of synthesized this pretty succinctly, that I want to jump off of. He said, "It's not hard to reconcile that Dave Chappelle, once he got rich enough to be comfortable for life, reverted to ideas suited to people who feel entitled to certainty and comfort in their notion of the world, including their perception of others. Regular asshole stuff." So I think what's going on with these comedians is, like, it's honestly pretty telling that we're sitting here identifying them as like kind of not like someone like Bob Hope as like not political, because he was a big icon in like the Nixon era, like clean, back to American values kind of guy. He did all the first USO shows and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And to look at him and go, that's not a person, is like saying, well, he doesn't have an accent. He's in America and he's talking a certain way, so he doesn't have an accent, right? But he's white, right? And when I say white, also that's a complicated thing, because it doesn't just mean the color of your skin. It refers to this complex thing that's sort of formed in America as the concept of being like a first-class citizen. And I think what's going on with a guy like Chappelle is that, he and by the way, one of my favorite comedians of all time, and that's why I'm criticizing him so much.
Right.
I really, if you'd asked me at any point until the last few years, honestly, top 3 comedians, he's always in there. Like, I love Chappelle, which is why this is coming from a place of, you should criticize artistically things you respect. So for me, with people like that get really famous and rich and successful, they become kind of frozen in like the year that it happened. And I think the reason Chappelle's becoming sort of like more monstrous and weird as he gets older is because what happens in that moment is that you cease to be like in actual relations with society, and it moves and you don't. And so we've got this person who's, like a lot of these comics, grappling with this thing that irritates them, and it probably irritates them a little bit more than it irritates the rest of us, because for them it's in stark contrast to this tendency that your brain kind of wants, which is to relax and to stop, like a shark, stop swimming, and I think that's also why it tends to overlap with older people, but it's the older people who came from generations where they had, I mean, what is the thing we always say about boomers? It's like, well, the world was fucking easy for you. Like, of course you have a collection of guitars and classic cars and stuff like that. If you're an old white guy, like, great. The world isn't really different from us. So I think this sort of like self-victimization and this looking at, imagining an enemy that is a vague amorphous culture is, I don't know how else to say it. It's just old guy stuff. It's like, and it's rich guy stuff too. And it's also, poor people buy into this shit too, because we live in a world of temporarily embarrassed millionaires, so it's not just like, I'm not going to sit here as a, reductionist and go, oh, it's just rich people shit either, but it's a rich point of view, of not wanting to ever be bothered by a thing again, and wanting, and also try like explaining away that feeling as, oh, it must be this new phenomenon known as a culture. It's something that I can yell at long enough to get everyone to stop doing, because it came from nowhere. Like, these voices have always been around. They just didn't have, the internet, right? You didn't have so much social media. A comedian used to have a green room that they hid inside of, and they never had to read YouTube comments and stuff like this. I mean, what's absurd to me about this is that Chappelle has done like 3 or 4 specials just pissed off about the fact that someone wrote a think piece about him online. That person got paid $50. That shit doesn't pay anything, It's just to put out there to express a point of view that you're perfectly allowed to. It's something
Right.
that when you react to it like that. Go ahead.
But okay, well, couple things. We'll talk more about just Chappelle in a bit, because I want to defend Chappelle a little bit more, and also push back against the reaction to him. But in the parrot room, I want to save that for the paying customers. That's the juicy bit. but I want to go back to this thing about Bob Hope and pure comedy. Like, I'm not a fan of Bob Hope. I've never seen a Bob Hope movie. I do know that he was, for me, I think of Bob Hope because he was on TV when I was a kid. And I think of him as associated with the Reagan administration more than Nixon, because I wasn't around in Nixon's time, really. And yeah, being apolitical is a political move. Steve Martin is another great example of an apolitical comic that actually, the fact that he became so successful when he did was showed that the new left and the radical movement of the 60s and 70s had died off, and that he was a return to normal. He was a return to the status quo. So like, I understand that perspective, but on the other hand, I think it's complicated, because I do think that comedy fundamentally is about, it's not just about jokes and laughter, but about, I don't know, some sort of shared experience about the absurdity of life, turning people's pain into something that you can share and laugh at. I mean, I feel like a fucking Hallmark card. But I do think that's what makes really great comedy great, is when you feel like a human connection to the comedian. And that's why confessional comedy works, I think. That's why Rodney Dangerfield is relatable, that kind of,
Yeah.
So and Bob Hope, apparently, I don't know this from having watched him, but according to Norm Macdonald, he was very good at getting the audience to laugh at his humanity rather than laugh at his jokes. And the other thing I'll say is, like, I know Woody Allen is canceled. I shouldn't mention Woody Allen, but according to Norm Macdonald, Woody Allen stole almost everything from Bob Hope. So it wasn't a white thing. Like his early comedy, his whole persona was Bob Hope's persona from the old road pictures. And then, Chris Rock, huge fan of Woody Allen, probably took some of that essence of Bob Hope from Woody Allen in the process. So it's not a white guy thing. It's a comedy thing.
Well,
I would argue.
I mean,
I'm trying to point to the comedy part. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. So I got to take umbrage with a few parts of that. Like,
okay.
Because, whiteness is becoming a first-class citizen. So you can be a person of color and be like, trying to get that, I mean, this is a tricky thing to argue about, because if you water down that definition enough, well, then we're just talking about being, you know, a class or something like that. And, you know, we're socialists, so that probably maybe isn't that the worst thing in the world. But I think that's what all these famous people have in common. Because for me, as a leftist, as a comic, like I don't think in terms of, oh, the great titans of comedy, like, oh, the what's your Mount Rushmore of comedy, the greatest of all time. That's a fan point of view. If you ask me who my favorite comics are, I'm gonna list a bunch of people who are working right now who you've never heard of, because I'm in comedy.
Right.
And I personally think a lot of them have points of view that are way more interesting than people that are doing their 7th Netflix special. Because after a while, like when you first start writing as a comic, you can do this thing you're describing, which is connect on the basis of humanity in ways that are just way more resonant than when you're a rich famous person complaining about, like, oh, don't you hate when your caviar is spoiled, you know, which is essentially like the coming out of most of these fucking people.
Yeah, that's certainly, you know, Dave Chappelle had bits of moments like that in the special, like when he said, if you ever see me in a Walmart, by the way, that means my life has gone to hell. Like that, you know?
I mean, that's a funny commentary on what he's talking about, but like, but these specials bore the shit out of me because they're all about the same thing. And he's really good. So he does something that's really tricky, which is he's still funny from time to time within these specials. Like he still has it. You see this with every aging, brain decaying, fucking brain wormed, famous rich comic, is that they still
watch the ageism, man, because I've got the brain worms. All right, so you gotta be careful around me. I'm fragile. Go on.
I'll save it for the second half. I'll remember that.
Okay.
But I mean, they're always these specials are such strange artifacts to watch, because, like, you know, I'm fascinated by them, so I watch all of them. I watched like the Nick DiPaolo one that came out a couple years ago, where he released it on YouTube because he couldn't get it put up anywhere, and it was him just yelling about all this same shit or whatever. And they're always really interesting to me because the tools are there. You can see the techniques and moves, and so there's these, you know, on a craft level, these fucking timing things that they do, and these like ways of setting up jokes that no amateur comic knows how to do. But then the content of what they're talking about is just, it's not just that it's annoying and that it's about cancel culture, it's also only about cancel culture. Like, comedy's an art form. It's not meme just pushing boundaries, it's not just speaking truth, it's looking a big umbrella thing. It can be about anything. I mean, watch Eric.
I saw a meme on Facebook recently that even I, the guy who published Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, had to admit was funny. Said the text was, it's hilarious to note all you have to do is take a picture of a smug man and put the Netflix logo next to them and you got a comedy concert special thumbnail. So like, and there's like 4 examples of a Netflix comedy special called Triggered, with the guy looking really smug.
Those are real. There really were like 10 of those within the span of like 2 years, because a real phenomenon is occurring, which is that people are, you know, reaching a point where they need a scapegoat, I think. And that's my real beef with like the cancel culture thing, is that I think it's a very devious scapegoat. And so one thing people bring up a lot when you talk about this is like this kid, Shane Gillis, who got fired from SNL. He got hired in a round of hirings. They hire people all the time. It's weird because it's not always news, but like it shows a meat grinder. People get thrown in, thrown out all the time. And a few years ago, this kid got hired, and he was immediately fired, like before he ever made it to the stage. And it was this big controversy in comedy because what had happened is somebody dug up like an old podcast clip of his where he was doing like an Asian accent or whatever. And then there was this huge inter-comedy discussion about whether, you know, is that racist, or are people not understanding that there was irony, or, you know, how do audiences play into this, you know? And it was this whole fucking thing. But a lot of grifter types came along, and I think they saw an opportunity here to rile people up and go, even if this is like an unconscious thing that happens, honestly, I think this is how it works, is go, you know, there's this cancel culture thing, and it's the reason that this guy lost a job, and we all need to be, you know, vigilant about it. And also, you should listen to my podcast and subscribe to the Patreon and buy all my books about cancel culture and stuff like that. It's usually
Yeah.
So
Look, I tell you, with Zero Books, you know, we have a YouTube channel. We're always looking for clicks. And I have to walk a line about this stuff because the algorithm rewards you
right
for that kind of phony outrage about
well, of course
stuff, right?
it's rewarding because everyone is unhappy for a reason they can't place, and this is a pretty good explanation that appeals to a lot of people. So here's my point.
I do think I'm just gonna say this. I think the urge to cancel on the left stops us from thinking, stops us from engaging, and makes us look bad and unpalatable to most normal people. And I think that the kind of ratioing that I went through was, in certain sense, deserved, because I walked right into it, you know, knowing full well that it was gonna. If I didn't know the extent it was gonna happen, but I knew people would get mad. So, like, I'm not a victim of anything, but I do think that people are victimizing themselves when they try to change the cultural attitudes of America in this way.
Well, I don't think. Listen, that's a second point I got to get to after.
Yeah, right.
My point about the Shane Gillis thing, I think, is a good place for us to start as leftists, because if you know actually what happened there. So Saturday Night Live is a huge corporate thing owned by like Viacom, one of those huge networks, right? And you have to sign like an insurance clause when you get hired that says if you ever, you know, did anything racist in your past and it gets dug up, you will be fired, right? We have to, because otherwise you could get sued. And then, right? So why did they hire people in the first place? To make money. They don't give a shit about art. That is not how businesses work. They hire people that they think their audience is going to like. So then why do they fire somebody? Same reason, to protect the bottom line, right?
Right.
So you got a guy like Lorne Michaels who comes into the picture, and he was running that guy all around, apparently, like, you know, saying like, "Oh, I'm doing everything I can to try to protect your career and all this stuff." Lorne Michaels is the boss, okay? Cancel culture. The reason he fired this employee of his was because he wanted to protect his bottom line, but nobody wants to be known as the boss that fired you purely because it's part of the business. So cancel culture is a very convenient narrative for the boss to go, "I didn't fire you. Cancel culture fired you. It was all these leftists and online SJWs and stuff like that." And the reason that is a ridiculous like explanation, I think, is because the boss has control over whether or not you work or you are fired. But we have no control over this billions of people using the internet and expressing their opinions. These are now a reality that we live in. There are just these waves and crests that occur online. And it's like, you know, sticking your finger in a dike. Like, you cannot hold back the outcomes.
You're not allowed to say dike, Jake. You can't say dike. Go on. And you certainly can't say sticking your finger in one.
Don't blame me. Blame the Dutch. That's their thing.
Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Okay. I had a thought, and I'm going to see if I can, brainworms. But my thought was, recently, do you know who Jared Bauer is, or have you ever heard of the YouTube channel Wisecrack? You ever heard of this channel?
Vaguely sounds familiar.
Yeah. It was it's a pretty big YouTube channel. It does philosophy. It's not a comedy thing. But it's like the philosophy of Minecraft, that kind of channel, right? Or,
I think I've watched a few of these.
Like 100 different videos about Rick and Morty. Yeah. And but when he started, it was a little bit more serious. I actually wrote for them a little bit for a while, but I washed out because I was too Marxist. And I had him on because he quit the channel and moved to Finland, I think. And because like nervous breakdown in Hollywood is basically what happened. But he came on. He had read Canceling Comedians While the World Burns. He wanted to interview Ben Burgess on his channel, which he did. We did a collaboration. I interviewed him on our channel. And what he thought was that, the real reason that cancel culture existed was because Hollywood was in disarray and people are struggling to, eke out careers, and everybody is just in a very precarious position when you're trying to make a career in Hollywood, right? So you're using any tool you can to try to get ahead. And also there's this sort of phony Hollywood liberal culture where it's still run by the same rich people and big corporations, and it's all the same product, but now we put a gloss on it, right? That was, I'm not doing what he said justice, but the thing that was interesting to me about talking to him was I brought up towards the end of the conversation, said, but look, why is everyone feeling so precarious? Because we now have an internet culture, a digital culture, where independent artists can try to make products, content on their own, and can develop, not huge mainstream success, but a career without the backing of these corporations. And what I was asking him was, why is there so little truly interesting filmmaking that's just being independently done for these digital platforms like YouTube or Vimeo or wherever? And I think maybe there is a platform that puts experimental films up that I should check out. Someone told me that. But the point, when it comes to comedy, in a world without the struggle for the SNL slot, would cancel culture even be a thing? And do you think that, the Patreon model, the podcast world, is a way for comedians to be true to their vision and not worry so much about being canceled by Lorne Michaels, not really the mob?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like Patreon. I make my money off of it. And one of the things that's really nice about it is that you can't cancel someone's Patreon. You can't call Patreon and tell them, well, not that would really happen. I mean, Patreon doesn't give a shit. Let's put it this way. Patreon is in Lorne Michaels' position, right? They don't give a shit what I say on my show. They just care that it brings in money. So it sort of functions in a way that cuts some of the edges off of that. Mm-hmm. I think that this age we're living in with this tech stuff is, to some extent it's a good thing. It kind of makes things a little bit more egalitarian, but like, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's beside the point to me to really think about things this way, because I think you're right to point out that there's precarity, and it exists to different degrees in different parts of society and within like an art form like stand-up or something like that. Mm-hmm. Having something like Patreon is good because it puts you in a less precarious situation. I personally, before Patreon, never struck out to quit my day job and think I would do something as foolish as try to be a comedian, because I am like not. I mean, I fucking.
Did you ever try like touring? Are there enough comedy clubs where you could you have made, when you started, could you have made a living just going on the road from one comedy club to another across the United States? Was that a possibility?
I started doing stand-up like 15 years ago or something like that. And back then there were people that lived on the road, not even just as headliners, but as features, right? Which is like the middle act. And then the economy changed in a lot of ways. And the underlying nuts and bolts, the base of all this stuff is what changed. And then that expressed itself through the job, right? And so for me, first of all, even back then, I don't know if I would have done it and become like a headliner, because as soon as you make that jump where you're like, okay, I only do this and I have to do, Chattanooga and then the Looney Bin and whatever, Ohio after that, and et cetera, and so on and so forth, you've painted yourself into a corner, because now you have to only talk about certain things, and you can get canceled and you can lose that job. And honestly, I don't feel that bad for those fucking people, because I've always seen this as a working class guy, and I've always been like, just fucking have a day job where you work at a restaurant or something like that, and you can actually make legitimate art that is not confined by all these things, by sort of like presuming that that you're only valid as an artist if you are doing it 100% of the time. And so that's why I see this as like, when comics are complaining about getting knocked down from such great heights as like being hired from SNL, or like, oh, I lost a Netflix deal or whatever, which isn't even happening most of the time. I go, boo-hoo. Oh, you didn't get to be, a very rich, posh, protected artist. Well, if you didn't achieve that, you never had it to begin with. And even like that, it never even happens. Like that guy I was talking about, Shane Gillis, he now has a Patreon that makes like more money per month than he would have made on SNL ever. No one gets paid as much money as this dude's making off of Patreon. So I'm like, this doesn't exist. Like there's now a cottage industry.
Yeah. But the SNL thing is not just about the salary from SNL, but so many people from SNL go on to make movies and be kind of long-term celebrities in the culture.
Well,
maybe that's not the case anymore.
To that, I think
I don't think people feel entitled to that, but when you get hired, I mean, I can imagine myself in this guy's position. But you get hired, your dream's there. I work so hard, and then once you get hired, then I deserve it. You know, like now the proof is in the pudding. I got to this point because I'm so great.
Are you a comedian? I mean, why are you schooling me on how the career of comedian works?
Because I feel like it's not that different than like being a science fiction novelist or something, because I am that. Like I did struggle in a similar kind of industry where, like, you know, so you start out writing short stories, you try to get attention, then you try to get a book deal. And then, you know, if you manage to get a book deal and you sell 200,000 copies or something, then then you've made it. Right. So there's a hierarchy of, you know, it's like you get paid $50 a short story, you know, if you're lucky to start with, if they're not just paid in contributors copies. I mean, like I've been in a similar position. I don't know if it's not the same thing as stand-up comedy.
Well, I guess to me it seems bougie to like feel like that is even a good outcome in a specific art form. And I'm saying this because I always think about punk musicians when I talk about this sort of stuff. I love punk music, and most people that make that type of music would never presume to go like, oh, I should be kept and made and you know, I should have an agent and get booked on somebody who does all this work for me. And then, you know, it's, oh, what if I lose all this stuff I made? Like the point is to actually be uncompromising in what you're doing. And if that means that you never get out of the gutter, so be it, because you're making a better product in the gutter. And that's, to me, that's the heart of the working class.
Well, then I feel, you know, vindicated as a mid-tier, never hugely successful fiction writer.
Well, than you would be had you become like Stephen. No, he's not a. Well, I guess he's a fiction writer. I was trying to think of it.
If I become like, let's say William Gibson or someone like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Okay, just as one wannabe creative artist to another, like, don't you feel though that you want your work to be as widely accepted and consumed, I guess is the way I would put it in today's culture? Is horrible, but like, don't you want a big audience? Don't you want to have a big impact on the culture? Don't you have something to say for the whole world? Don't you want to be remembered after you're dead? Don't you want them to teach your comedy, you know, 100 years from now? I mean, aren't you the king narcissist like I am? Why don't you want more, Jake?
Well,
is that bougie?
I mean, I kind of think that if you are one of the 20 people who have a special called Triggered right now, in like hundreds of years, you're probably not going to be remembered as much as the person who came after this and maybe crested everything in a different direction or something.
Right. Yeah, that's for sure.
But also, I think like right now, if you have one of those Triggered specials, I look at that and I go, yeah, you are. One way of looking at this is that you have a massive audience and everyone in America likes you. Another way of looking at that is that you've reached a lowest common denominator and everyone in America likes you. And that's not a good thing artistically. It's good if you're selling bread or fucking clothes or something like that, where you're a capitalist and you want to sell as much stuff as possible to validate what you've done, as this means I make a good product or whatever. But with art, I mean, I don't know. You know what? I'm a millennial. I feel I have much more in common with Gen Xers when it comes to this. I feel like when I talk about this stuff, where I'm like, didn't we used to all think that pop music sucked? Like, didn't we all used to think that the most popular thing sucks and that you're actually cool if you have a more authentic take?
Oh no, it's a contradiction in my thinking too. Like, I wanted to be a cool underground novelist and have everyone read my books.
Yeah,
that's you know. So yeah, I understand. You're right. I mean,
I think that desire to have everyone read your stuff or watch your comedy or whatever is what kind of pushes things in this direction, where the artist becomes more and more deranged about the process, because it is a contradiction. And honestly, like, I think what's really going on in the minds of Chappelle and people like this who get fixated on this concept is that you don't actually ever finish, and you never actually reach the promised land, and you never actually get to this imagined place where you're like, I did it, I'm happy with myself, I'm existentially fulfilled, because what you actually want is something we have not achieved yet, right? My big galaxy brain take about this is that your brain wants to be a communist. It wants to live in harmony with its fellow man. When you get into your golden castle, you're like, none of these people are happy. They're all maniacs, and they're all on their fucking computer all day, like arguing with people. And I think what's happening there is that you have this situation where there is still a precarity. Even if you're that rich and famous, you're going to lose some money depending on whether somebody writes an article about you or whatever. And instead of realizing that you now have that precarity in common with workers all over the world, because you could be working as a dishwasher at a restaurant and your job is exactly as precarious as Chappelle's is. All it takes is one person to complain, or your boss just on a whim to decide they don't want to have you there anymore. Like, instead of considering yourself like a tragic story because you have so much farther to fall than that person, you should look at the entire picture and realize, oh, the problem is the precarity, right? The problem was capitalism the whole time. But when you have like these like petty bourgeois types who start to realize that precarity, what do they classically do throughout history? Instead of identifying with the class below them, they identify with the class above them, because we're temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? And so you start to look at that as like a young, entrepreneurial, individualistic, capitalist, which is what a comic unfortunately is in this world.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And what you need is a fucking scapegoat for this paranoia and bad feeling you have, and this idea that like something's coming to get you. And it's just like Trump with it telling you, oh, immigrants are the problem. It's someone's coming along and going, this thing that makes you really fucking agitated when you look at it on your cell phone, like when you look at like cringe reels and stuff like that, that's like a specter of a fucking looming thing. That what is the implication that we can like root it out? Like, we're gonna go around the country and fucking shake everyone by the shoulders and go, you stop doing this thing. Like, you can't. You're talking about the expression of a contradiction on the base level of class, right being expressed in this way. I think like it just seems profoundly Marxist to me to look at this way.
Well, I'm going to defend my Marxism in the parrot room because we're coming up on 41 minutes, but I want to say something about what you said that I agree with.
Sure.
Which is that, like, I definitely agree that the artist in today's society, even when they succeed and reach the pinnacle of success as society defines it, is never going to be happy. One of the things I recognize in myself is, like, I struggled for years to get a short story published in National Magazine, right? And I finally did, and it didn't change anything about anything. Like, I got a couple $100 and almost no recognition, and then
that is like one of the most bittersweet feelings in the world, and every artist has it.
Right. right. And then I go, okay, I know what I need. I need a novel. I got to sell a novel. Then I sold my first novel. And again, the letdown after my first novel came out was not just because it didn't sell millions of copies. I made a little bit of royalties off of it, not a lot. It was because it didn't solve anything in my life. It was nice to have done it. So I've gotten to a point now where when I write something or I work for Zero Books, even, I mean, I work for Zero Books and make what I do because I get paid to, but I try to not have the same ego investment in it. And by ego investment, it's not like it's not that I think too well of myself when I make these things. It's the ego investment is, oh, this thing will redeem me. It never will. Yeah. So yeah, that's what you have to let go of. And I think maybe if it gets success really young, you might get stuck in this thought of I can get redeemed. Like if your first time out at bat, you hit a home run, you might just start to feel like, oh yeah, this will work eventually. I feel like people need to fail a little bit more to be healthy.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that, like, I know some older comics who sort of break away from their peers by realizing, I think, what their younger colleagues are saying about this, and hipping to it a little bit, but it seems like they're fighting the voice in their head when they talk about it. But I mean, this is you see this all the time, especially in something like comedy, where the product, the artistic product, is often like a take, which is confusing because it's like, is this philosophy or is it joke writing? I don't really know. But like, something I noticed recently is I think Jon Stewart just said something about cancel culture recently, where he went like, it's not even real, like no one ever gets canceled, which is a thing that like me and my friends are screaming from down here. Yeah, dude. I see that and I'm like, oh, the first one of these guys figured it out, and within 10 years or so, the rest of them are either going to catch up with him or sink into the tar pit.
Right. Well, I do think cancel culture online for the vulnerable exists. Like, I think that, you know, that when this we can start, maybe we can start the next round of conversation about this. Like this trans woman, Daphne, who was a friend of Chappelle's, the ratioing or the attacks that she received online probably contributed to her demise. But you know, and there are other people who've lost their jobs and who are not in the entertainment industry, who've been canceled, or publicly shamed, or what have you.
Brother,
and
do I know it, man? You ever seen my Twitter feed?
Yeah. No, I don't follow your Twitter feed as much as I ought to.
Well,
maybe.
it's pretty bad, dude. I get fucking doxxed all the time. I had my nudes put out there everywhere. Every fucking person
you let someone take a picture of you nude? You are a millennial. What are you doing right? What's people, if they went over to your podcast, what would they find? What's going on in your podcast?
Oh,
right
sure. We do a mixed bag on my show. By the way, also, likewise, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks for, I appreciate that you let me yell at you and even encouraged me to do that. It's always a good time talking to people in good faith, you know? So, likewise, welcome on my show anytime. So on PDA, on Pod Damn America, it's kind of a mixed bag. We do we're comedians, so sometimes we fucking just riff about the news, and then we try to do these deep dives. We just did a really good one on her name, Kirsten Cinema, and her career, and you know, I think we've got some historical things in the works. And then on my other show, Why You Mad, we get a little bit more into the pop culture, so kind of similar to what we were doing here. I think we're going to talk about Squid Game this week, and
my kid keeps talking about Squid Game. What the hell is Squid Game? Is that a show? Is it a video game? What is it?
Well, it's a long form concert that is it's 7 concerts in a row. It's a TV show. I'm just fucking with you. I was
totally buying that. I was a concert. Finally, something is a concert.
No. It's a Netflix series. It's really good. It's Korean, right? It's people always say South Korean as if it was going to be a North Korean show, but no, it's Korean, and it's like there's a lot of really good like kind of horror and stuff coming out of Korea. I mean, especially Bong Joon-ho won, you know, the Oscar for Parasite, so there's now a spotlight on this like kind of interesting anti-capitalist shit that's coming out of Korean film. And Squid Game is essentially, without ruining it, you know, it's kind of like there's a genre of film called like Battle Royale now, which is based off of, if you've ever seen the film Battle Royale, a bunch of kids fucking kill each other in a game show, right? The Hunger Games is like the American version of that. So Squid Game is basically that genre of TV show, but it's like, it's good, it's artistic, it's got, if you're a leftist, you'll see all of the anti-capitalist metaphors and undertones and stuff like that. And it's pretty cool. So we're going to dissect it and talk about it a little bit, because there's also stuff going on in it that's like specific to Korean culture that you might not notice through the Western lens. But like, yeah, I mean, I am a leftist, but I'm also a culture guy, so like I love dissecting film and stuff like that.
All right, so people should go over, and the people who are cooler than I am and know about Squid Game already should definitely go over and watch your stuff. And I'll tell you what, Jake, I'm going to take this part of this recording snippet and put it onto the public one, so people can get, the bigger audience will get directed to your
show.
Cool.
Well, if you're in Florida, check out my Twitter, because I've got some tour dates coming up. I'm playing Fest, the punk festival in Gainesville, Florida, and I'm doing Jacksonville after that.
Cool. All right. Are you going to be at the Funny Bone or any place like that in the future? I love comedians when they're on talk shows. They're like, I'm going to be at Jolly's or
well, we're all carnies, like, so it's just in our DNA to go, oh shit, I got a what do you call it, like shill right now at the end of it.
Right.
Actually, you know what? I did almost forget to plug my album. I have a new album out on Stand Up Records. It'll be out on November 5th. And
Cool.
it's called Bad Omen because I recorded it right before the fucking world ended. And it feels weird now.
Okay, can I put a link to Bad Omen in the description, and people could click on it and then go actually buy your album?
I'll see if I can figure out how to do that. Yeah, because it's not
Okay.
up yet, but we'll figure something out.
Pre-order it, maybe.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.